So why do you think I put up there, "Never Tell Me the Odds," as the title of this keynote? You're all academics, which means you are all smart people. Somebody speculate for me. Why did I put that up there?
Because the odds for the revolution were...
The odds what?
The odds were not in favor for the revolution.
For the revolution of...
Like against the imperium.
Against the Imperium, very good.
Yeah.
So the Imperium are the, in this case, what do you think the Imperium is? For family business, what's the Imperium? Let's go back to the year 1980. 1980 was the first time that I started doing anything in family business research. So we're talking a long time ago. The Imperium was the Strategic Management Society. The Imperium was not yet the Academy of Management. The Academy of Management didn't draw numbers above maybe 800 or 900 people to a conference. It was the small days of the Academy of Management. The Academy of Management Journal and the Academy of Management Review were laughed at by senior academics. What was the most important business publication of the time? What's that?
Beginning of 80s.
Yeah, beginning of 80s.
Michael Porter.
Oh, in terms of a book that mattered, yes. But the academic journal was the Administrative Sciences Quarterly. That was the Imperium at the time. So back in 1980, back in 1982, 83, as I started my graduate studies and the field of family business was just beginning, I was told, do not study family business, you will never have a career. Do not study family business, you will never get a job. Do not study family business, you will never have a publication. You understand? That's where this comes from. Don't tell me the odds. Look at this room. Nearly 100 people from just one language region. And then if you go to any of the other conferences, you know how many people end up showing up. So don't tell me the odds. So now we're going to look at the past. And those of you who've heard me talk before, you know this history, the way I view the history of the family business field. In 1930 or so, there was a study done which basically said, it was, you know, business schools are a relatively modern invention. Before business schools, there were schools of commerce. And this was a study on the first business schools. And it said, you know what, business schools are okay, but they lack family character. And we really need to put that back in. But nobody cared, and it died a quick death. Nothing much else happened until there was a dissertation in 1953. Then there was a guy, Leon Danko, who started doing a lot of work consulting with family businesses in the United States. And he started a center. In the 60s, there were about 9 books published and articles. And then in the 70s, only 12. You get how almost there was no field at this point. There were lots of family businesses. But for some reason, they had no cachet. Nobody wanted to study them. What's one thing that listed companies is different from private companies? You get your data from listed companies. Family businesses are not listed companies by and large, although they still make up 35 to 70% of all listed companies. But as information on the family is not available, family business as a topic of study was very hard to come by. And then the field hits a little bit of a tipping point and things start to take off. And that started, I like to say, with a special issue in 1983 in the journal Organization Dynamics. It was completely on the topic of family business. And you can see the incredible progression in the 80s and the 90s as things move forward. It started to get on a trajectory, but I will tell you, even in the 90s, in the early 90s, it was not clear that the field would survive. I don't think I felt safe that the field would survive until about the year 2005, 2006. That's when I really thought, we've got some sticking power. Another little slide. Change you must or die you will. And in the 80s and 90s, most of the research was basically practitioner-oriented research. There was not a lot of bringing in or trying to integrate other fields or disciplines into the research that we were doing. I became editor of Family Business Review. And at that time, one of the things that I wanted to do was to invite other scholars from other fields to start doing stuff in the family business field. And that was one of the changes that we needed to make. And as you can see, since that time, the field gained greater acceptance. So if you look at the journals that people have published family business stuff in, Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, ASQ, JBV, all the typical actors. Now there have been literally dozens of special issues. Look at that number. More than 30 special issues in journals in the last decade on family business. 40 years ago, if I had said one journal should do an article on family business, I would have pretty much been laughed at. You get the idea? There's been glossy magazines that have come out, websites, there's 2 international organizations that do research programs for family business, specifically and only. And there's groups like this one that are doing stuff for family business scholars. And now we have 2 arguably A-impact factor print academic journals, which is Family Business Review. I have been fortunate to be editor of both of them at one time or another. Family Business Review, and now the Journal of Family Business Strategy, which just got upgraded in the ABDC, the Australia Business Deans Council, or whatever they are. And we have undergraduate majors, MBA classes, et cetera, et cetera. So things have really, really taken off. And you can see just by looking at that kind of a graph. And this is only up until like 2012, but it continues on. It gets even steeper and steeper in terms of the number of family business articles, family business citations, et cetera, that are coming out. So it's a good field. You guys are doing good stuff. I'm not going to go into these in detail. You can take a look at these later. I presume we'll be able to get slides to everybody. But these are just some of the topics that were early topics, and succession has never really gone away. You get to 2007. In the late 90s and early 2000s, agency theory became like that was the thing everybody had to talk about. And guess what the thing everybody has to talk about today is? That would be SEW. Everybody has to talk about SEW and understand what SEW is. And now I'm going to go into what I think needed research areas are. And go over those for a little bit. And then after I do that, I'm going to talk about what I think makes for relevant research. So here's some needed areas. Number 1, fixing misspecified models. I'll talk about that in a minute. And UCSA like the 3-circle model. And those models and research projects that have what I call theoretical sinkholes. Which means that there's something major that they don't explain, or something major that just doesn't make sense at the outset. And it's nice to believe it makes sense, but just a little scratching beneath the surface, and you have to say to yourself, well, this theory doesn't really necessarily make sense. Then we have the topic of long-term survival and sustainability. And I know that's a great topic for a lot of my colleagues. that you guys have been studying here, and what makes for long-term survival and sustainability. And of course, when you address that question, you have to ask, is it firm survival or is it family survival? And that's one thing that we have to offer other disciplines, which is, what's the more important economic and social unit? Is it more important for us to concern ourselves with firm survival? Or is it more important for us to concern ourselves with the survival of the family, particularly if the family is capable of organizing assets and people for productive purposes that are directed towards the betterment of society? Everybody understand my point? Okay. That's long-term positive thinking for the world. Then we have a topic that is one that I've been telling people they need to really study for a long time, but I think because people don't understand the basic concept, and by the way, if you don't understand the basic concept from a managerial point of view, not from a public capital markets point of view, you are missing something that allows you to connect with business owners, which is the cost of equity. How do families set the returns that they expect from their businesses? And what does that mean? Right? How do the internal accounting structures work to come up with that number? Let me tell you something else that I all think you need to know. There's been a lot of study recently on what it means to be a competent owner. What competencies do you need to be an owner? What competencies do you need to be a competent, some very good researchers in the room have been working on this stuff. What competencies do you need to be a competent family manager? What competencies are required? And one of the competencies is basic financial literacy. And I would say that if you really want to be a decent scholar in the family business field, you need to have basic financial literacy, both on the company side and also on the family wealth side. Otherwise, talking to your research subjects doesn't really work. We are like aliens descending on a world we have never seen, trying to study the social system, for you sociological researchers, without having any real knowledge of the aliens that we are studying and the languages that they talk. Everybody understand what I'm saying, I would assume. And in fact, to me, you have to get to the point, financially speaking, where you can understand financial statements and managerial finance well enough to understand how non-family managers, so-called professionals, can manipulate the numbers easily in ways that families cannot understand or see. And if you're asking in your heads, how can that be done? There are lots of ways that can be done, and I'm happy to explain them to you later. Okay. So, cost of equity, which has a lot to do with how families view the long term, and then the topic of having some kind of family orientation and what does that mean. And then lastly, something that I've been working on, which has kind of grown out of that view of ownership competence, which is the idea of using a fit model to explain family business a little bit better, and what works and what doesn't work. And the fit model thinking comes from psychological studies back in the 1930s and 1940s, but most recently, if you've been doing any research in the business fields, you'll know it as strategic fit models. All right, let me look at the misspecified model. For example, the three-circle model. And why is it a misspecified model? Because it assumes that positions create interests. Where's my legal scholar? He was somewhere in the room. There you are. So, in legal theory, we believe that position creates interest. And whatever position you are defines whether or not you have a conflict of interest with a situation or an ownership or something that you're involved in. In family dynamics theories, we believe that family dynamics create interests and positions. You understand the difference? That is, I am in a role because of family dynamics, I was the troublemaker in my family. That puts me in a position in the ownership family model of not being in the family group, but maybe being an owner, therefore having a natural positional conflict. But that positional conflict with my brother, who was the one who always followed the rules and wanted to make mom and dad happy, who is owner, manager, and in the key position, that conflict predated that stuff. That positional conflict grew from the family dynamics. And that's what I have at the bottom here, where family history and culture leads to family dynamics creates emotion-based conflicts and position-based conflicts, and there's just a little bit of added amplification of your conflict because of the position-based conflict. That would be fixing a model, trying to come around and really understand what's going on, as opposed to believing all too conveniently that it's the other way around. One of the reasons why the three-circle model can be so popular is because if you're in a position of authority, it removes you from responsibility for the conflicts that you've helped nurture and create in the life of your family. I'm no longer responsible. Of course my brother's going to be mad at me. He wants dividends and I want to invest. I didn't do anything to create the conflict. You get the psychological process behind it as opposed to the positional issues. I think I've made myself clear, unless you want me to go on about it. So why do people end up in their positions? Research question. Try and answer that one, and you will lead to some really important research on how maybe family dynamics should be shaped for long-term family viability. What has more valence and why? Positional interests or the emotional conflicts that predate positional interests? Research question 2. All right, next one I was wanting to deal with is rationalizing the opposing predictions of SEW. And some of you probably don't even know that there are opposing positions to socio-emotional wealth. And one of the opposing ones, or one of the contradictory predictions you can make from SEW is SEW requires the building of SEW stocks. And you have to build socio-emotional wealth in order to get to the second state, which is what's been researched, which is the protection of socio-emotional wealth. If you don't have a place in your theory for building what it is that you protect, and your theory says all you do is protect socio-emotional wealth, the theory has a huge hole. That's that sinkhole I was talking about. So when do you build it, and when do you protect? And we have no theory behind that. When does a family decide SEW stocks are high enough, and consequently limit decisions that risk firm control? And when do they decide that they need more? And where does that come from? And then what role does the variety of non-financial goals attainment play in this process? Because it's not just one non-financial goal, there's a whole variety of them. And how do they trade off? One of the problems with a lot of performance research is it's based on really crappy financial metrics. And sometimes the metrics are okay, but oftentimes they bear little relationship to anything that you and I would like to see if you were a business owner. And profitability is not the only financial metric. Return on assets is not the only financial metric. I don't know how many of you have significant real estate assets. I'm on the boards of 4 companies that have significant real estate assets, 2 of which are just real estate companies, and 2 others of which have whole divisions set up to manage their real estate portfolios. When you are in the real estate game, your net operating income, which is the amount of money you make from rents, So if all you're doing is measuring returns, you're saying, how do we increase our performance? We reduce our costs and we increase our rents, and that's increasing our performance. But that's not the real estate game. What's the real estate game? The real estate game is buying properties that have the potential for long-term appreciation and being able to meet your cash needs, not performance, but cash needs from your rents. If the real estate game is the potential to sell your property at a vastly increased price from where your family acquired it, what does it require you to have? Control. If you put your olive groves into a cooperative, and this is not something that I've recognized, I'm not the only person that has recognized this. My dear friend and colleague, Herman Corman, has also recognized this. If you put your properties into a cooperative to generate more short-term profit, what do you give up? Control. You can no longer sell your property. You have taken away one of the major levers of the real estate game. So SEW might be an alternative explanation, but in this case, I would venture to say that if I was a business owner, I would tell you it's not about protecting control for the purposes of control. It's about protecting control for the purposes of being able to sell a fundamentally appreciating asset. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Okay. So that raises two issues, which is the SEW issue as well as the performance issue, and how do we measure performance appropriately. And what I just told you, every business owner would understand. And to the extent that you understand it, it allows you to better talk to business owners. Because if you come in there with just the only SEW argument, they're going to go, well, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. They're cute, but they don't know what they're talking about. Long-term survival and sustainability, there's the whole notion of the idea that there's a performance survival link, and nobody has, that as far as I know in the research, short-term performance and long-term survival have never been linked in a way that shows any statistical reliability. I know it makes some intuitive sense when you first look at it, that if I have short-term performance, I have more money with which to do more things, to invest in the company, and therefore I can ensure my long-term survival. But indeed, the major way you get short-term performance is by gutting your ability to survive in the long term. So there's actually a paradox. Short-term performance often comes at the expense of long-term survivability if you're actually in business. And in fact, if you want long-term survivability and long-term performance, you sacrifice short-term performance by investing heavily so that you will have lots of different innovations, lots of different things that you can do to make more money in the long term. There's theories about how you get to long-term survival. They can all be tested. I had a student do a study on dynastic families a couple of years ago. That was very interesting. It showed a lot of, it was a qualitative study, interviewed a lot of dynastic families, and the qualitative study basically said, what other studies have kind of hinted at in the past, if you don't focus on the family and get the family to be competent and thinking about their long term, you can't maintain a dynasty. And the family also needs to have some ability to think about wealth independently from ongoing operations. And then the goal sets. Families don't have single goal sets. Families don't have single goals. Now, I know that this is becoming increasingly popular with listed companies, the whole ESG perspective, the whole idea that we look at environmental characteristics and social characteristics as well as financial results. But that's really new to the non-family business world, and that is bread and butter, basic motherland kind of things for family businesses. So more studies of what helps with long-term survival can be very useful. And I mentioned some of the things about cost of equity decisions. I think one of the only people who really took a look at this in a way that I thought was useful, that's just my point of view, has been Thomas Selberger, who's looked at some of the cost of equity decisions and noted, and this is something that often happens in the boardroom, which upsets me as well, which is if you lower your cost of equity, you actually have the ability to attract and look at projects that other people aren't looking at, which gives you a greater variety of things that you're going to accept, which improves the chances of lots of success. And it's a little bit opposite from what we think we learn in business school, which is come up with a cost of equity and make sure no project that you accept at the business level is below your cost of equity threshold. And indeed, if you're in a very sophisticated boardroom, top-level managers and board members understand that when you set a cost of equity threshold or a return threshold, even if you want to talk about internal rate of return, for example, of 15%, that means half your projects are above 15% that you're accepting and half are below, because that threshold is an average, not a threshold. It's what you're shooting for. It's a goal rather than a threshold. And threshold thinking versus average thinking changes the way you think about strategy. Just something to think about for family business research. And hopefully I'm not like talking over your heads, because if I am, that's not a good sign. Okay? Factors that impact family risk tolerance, also very important. How do we understand what family risk tolerance is? And one of the possible hypotheses are families in conflict have lower risk tolerance. Families in conflict could have lower risk tolerance, but also have much higher variance in risk tolerance as well. Why do I say that? Because if you're in a family and you have conflict, and the fundamental underlying belief is that if I could pay my family members more with dividends or whatever, then they'll leave me alone. I want to take more risks to generate more returns, to buy my family members peace. As opposed to the ones who are over here going, this guy is doing too many risky things, I'm in conflict with him, I never liked my older brother anyway, therefore I don't want him to take risks, but I want more money. You get the idea. There may be other things behind why families would accept risks or not risk. I'm just saying that I think family dynamics plays a role in risk tolerance overall. Family orientation, which is there a way of running a business that could be characterized as family? This would be similar to the entrepreneurial orientation studies for those of you who come from the entrepreneurship field. And then one would ask, what are some of the components of such an orientation, and what impact does a family orientation have on survival? And so far, there's only been one or two papers to even mention the idea of family orientation. And lastly is this fit model, which is in the traditional white background and black print, so you should all be able to see it. Which basically says, and this came out of noticing that most of what the practitioners, the advisors to family businesses say is that there's one best way to do things and you should do it that way. And they want the one single solution. And what I was seeing with a lot of the families that I know is that a lot of times their policies just didn't fit the values, culture, and history of the family. So theorize that perhaps we could come up with a fit model where the family's values and their goals have to have internal fit. The values and the goals can't be inconsistent. But the values and the goals then have to be consistent with the kind of practice we're in. For example, if our family is a very open and honest family, maybe we have liquidity shareholder agreements which say that ownership is more open to family members across branches. In-laws can have ownership, et cetera, as a measure of, as a way of looking at fit between the openness of the family and the openness of the policy. An open family should have an open policy. And then practice fit has to, within the practice things need to fit, and then between that and something that we are theorizing, Claudia, my wife, and I have been thinking about this, which is something called family maturity. That is, a more functional, more competent, more sustainable family can have a whole different set of policy characteristics, management characteristics, than a family that is very young, new, and has a very controlling environment to it. So we postulate that an immature family is a family where there's high needs for control and low ability to cooperate and problem solve. And a mature family has low needs for control and a high ability to communicate and problem solve. That would be at a very basic level or global level an understanding of what is meant by that mature family concept. What's in the distant future? I've said this a lot of times. I said business schools will increasingly teach family business orientation in the recognition of economic reality. Eventually, the empire of non-family business that dominates our schools will be overthrown because they're wrong. It's not the way the world works. The world is composed of family businesses. It's not composed of non-family, politically oriented behemoths that have no soul. It's not. There's just a few of those. The market orientation will still be taught, but as a tool and not as the foundation upon which businesses should be constructed and developed. As millennials and soon Gen Alpha, how many of you knew that the next gen is being called Gen Alpha? You did? It's very new. It's just like 4 or 5 weeks ago that they decided they're Gen Alphas. So I'm hoping it sticks, but that's what I've been reading on. As Gen Alpha, especially understand there is more to business than money, and if you talk to millennials, particularly in the United States, the last kind of company they want to work for is a soulless business, a business that has no love permeating its policies and management practices. And that's a big deal. All right, so what must research look like to keep our field vital? This is me getting on this is what research should be. A lot of people don't know that the first role I had as a researcher, and I had a little bit of a head start here. My father was a professor at Yale, and he had many labs reporting to him. And my first role as a researcher was doing work with rats. And I won't explain it because a lot of people get a little queasy understanding what had to be done. But the net result of that research were the modern day antidepressants, the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and the drugs that led to the antipsychotics that we now use. So when I first started doing research, the standards were incredibly high because it was medical research. And I was really young, but that was what I was doing. So I want to know what kind of research should we be doing here? Because in the business world, and in social sciences in general, people take research as though it doesn't matter if it's super accurate. It doesn't matter if our standards are high. Who's affected? It's all a game anyway, right? And my point of view is research is not a game. Research has real impact on people's lives. We have a responsibility when we become researchers. In medicine, if you screw around, you lose your job. But in business fields, you don't. So let's look at what research needs to look like to be vital. Relevance, somebody is just some cartoon taken off the internet. Relevance is somewhere in between what you want to say and what they're interested in. And yes, to some extent that's true, but that's mostly true if you are an entertainer. So for me, relevance is research that answers questions where the answers either directly inform outcome-based behavior or public policy, or there is a clear path to affecting outcome-based behavior or public policy. Most research does not do this. Most research just describes things, or says, here's what family businesses do. Like, well, I don't care what family businesses do, unless what they do can help me come up with some research that then can tell them what they should do. What they do is not enough. We are not anthropologists. If you want to be a family anthropologist, go for it. But to me, that does not do much for us. Everybody okay? It might make us feel better. Well, here's what family businesses do in general, and we do some really good stuff, and they don't. So I'm not all for that. Relevant research is practical and as such is related to action and is seen as useful by its constituents. Relevant research is not inclined towards theorizing. That doesn't mean theorizing isn't important. It's not inclined towards theorizing. Relevant research is conducted with scientific rigor. You follow the rules of science. Every so often somebody's remembered. Nobody in this room is that person. So for any of us to feel like our research or our theories or our babies, our children, does all research disservice. Because the open community and exchange of ideas without the feeling of ownership is what makes research progress. And I say this looking at research of hundreds, if not thousands of years, in a bunch of different fields. The first one I looked at is the history of medical research. And if you thought that anything that we do nowadays, you could actually remember who came up with those ideas, nobody does. Nobody does. But what did those early ideas do? They lead to the extension of longevity and the improvement in quality of life of all, and that is more important than whether my name or your name is remembered. Relevant research does not assume measures of success. And making you feel better, your interests or your career goals, do not make research relevant. And the first one is pretty important because a lot of people's research, particularly in the social sciences, are directed towards some issue they have of their own that they are trying to fix or resolve. Or through the research process, fix an issue that they have or try to resolve. Neither one of those things are criteria for making research relevant. Most research in the family business field is not relevant. Another silly cartoon. Define normal. The focus, as I just said, this focus has largely been on categories, descriptive, judgmental, comparative. Confirmation bias is rampant in our field. Or designed to allow people to feel that they or their families or the businesses are normal. And they're all kind of like psychological. For the most part, a lot of the research that's done in the family business field has psychological motivations behind why people are doing them. As opposed to other-oriented, I'm trying to help other motivations. So what's one of the worst reasons for a research path? One even more noxious motivation for research is insidious. That's a little bit of a reference to Star Wars. Is insidious careerism. In fact, one of the, was it Academy Management Journal of Perspectives just came out with 4 articles on why do we care about e-journals? Why do we care about them so much? And just as a little aside, one of my buddies is in charge of AACSB for North Africa and all of Europe, Tim Astrachan. And the way in which the AACSB, the way in which the accrediting bodies are moving is away from A-journals, just for you all to think in your careers long term. Not for me, I'm retired from academia, but away from A-journals and making people prove that they have had impact. And how do you prove you've had impact? Well, in research, one of the ways you do that is you come up with something that people can actually use and you can demonstrate the impact from research findings that you've conducted or come up with. Another way to do it is to look at how often you've been cited. And how often you've been cited is very loosely correlated with being in an A journal. Right? You're more likely to be cited if you've been in an A journal by people who want to publish in A journals. But that doesn't mean you're more likely to be cited. I've never tried to publish in an A journal. Created a couple A journals, never tried to publish in them. But I have close to 12,000 citations. And if you are a good academic, you might have 700 or 800. And if you're great, you're in the 5,000s. You get my point? It's not related. It's a measure of impact. That's probably the direction that business schools are going to be moving in. Insidious careerism, where people conduct research on the theories or work by influential scholars in order to advance their careers with little concern to whom they benefit by the research that they conduct. Everybody understands what that statement means. And you might look at me and you might go, well, this guy is kind of like a mystic or some kind of monk of family business scholarship, and that may be true. So that's why I put this up here. Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny, and it will consume you. Once you start down the dark path of considering that A journals are the only legitimate publication, that will become all-consuming, and the nature of your work will become less relevant over time. Absolutely convinced about that. This person, John Boyd, probably the most influential, in my opinion, strategist of all time, who nobody knows about. And if you ever want to go look up some John Boyd work, I think it would be very useful to you. Especially in the age of disruption. He says more about disruption than any other strategist that you could ever come to imagine. What he had these comments to say. This comes from a biography of the guy, and he had this famous line where he found somebody who could, in his opinion, have great potential to do great things. And he called this the do or be question. Tiger, one day you will come to a fork in the road, and you're going to have to make a decision about which direction you want to go. He raised his hands and he pointed. If you go that way, you can be somebody. You will have to make compromises and you will have to turn your back on your friends. But you will be a member of the club. You will get promoted and you will get good assignments. Then Boyd raised his hand and pointed in the other direction. Or you can go that way and you can do something. Something for your country. He was a member of the Air Force, for your Air Force and for yourself. If you decide you want to do something, you may not get promoted, and you may not get good assignments, and you certainly will not be a favorite of your superiors. But you won't have to compromise yourself. You will be true to your friends and to yourself. And your work might make a difference. To be somebody or to do something. In life, there is often a roll call or a choice. That's when you will have to make a decision. To be or to do. Which way will you go? Which way will you go as researchers? To be or to do? All right, so let's talk about relevant research. There's three basic kinds of research. I'm going to try and do this in the last 10 minutes. You have basic research, outcome research, or policy research, and practice research. And a lot of people think we have good basic research in the field. We really don't have any good basic research. Basic research would be how are family dynamics created, and then how do they affect something? That's really basic. How do family dynamics happen? How do we get conflicts? What's the nature of sibling rivalry in a business family? How does that take place? So basic research is the kind of research that comes long before you get to outcome-based prescriptions that you want to give for people. And basic research might have 4, 5, or 6 levels of questions before it comes up with, this is going to affect how we do something. Hydrogen technology and hydrogen as energy has been being studied for centuries. We still don't know how to make it work. But we've known from the beginning that if we could look at that, hydrogen as a fuel source is one of the cheapest fuel sources to transport. Once you can get it up there, batteries are heavy and expensive to transport. Hydrogen is for the kilocalories that come out of a kilogram of hydrogen. It's the highest there is outside of nuclear energy, and we all have decided that nuclear energy is too dangerous. On a kilocalorie per kilogram basis, hydrogen's the fuel, right? We don't know how we're going to get there yet. That's what basic research is about. How do we move from that, where we know that it will lead to something, to the something that we know we want to get, and to the something that will allow us to improve lives. An example, do the bonds of family lead to more cooperative behavior on average than groups without family bonds? I'll keep reading these because I can see that it is down. If yes, what promotes those bonds? And if yes, what conditions is cooperation most important? Under what conditions is cooperation most important? Which leads to performance? Which leads to survival, and so on? And if yes, what inhibits family bond-based cooperation? When does it not happen? And answers to these questions will all lead one day to some kind of behavioral guidance. Next topic, outcome research, seeks to answer a question where the answers give clear indication of what practices a family or business should follow, or what laws governments should enact. For example, what practices lead to successful succession? Big government topic. What practices lead to successful succession? Do we know? This field has been around for 40 years. Do we know? No, we don't. How many studies have had any kind of relationship shown between succession planning and successful succession? None. 0. So what practices do lead to successful succession? If you come up with the answer to that, you've done a great service for the world. So, as I say on the bottom, as you can see, the answer to this question might also lead to new theory and new practices that can then, again, be researched. Practice research. So these are things about how we affect the helping professions. How do we tell the helping professions how to do their jobs better? And this research, what practices they should engage in and what advice they should give that will be most effective. And it may vary from discipline to discipline. Some of the disciplines that interact with family businesses are psychology, law, finance, and so on. And it may vary based on context, right? If you are in a mode of helping or preserving a family. That's the preventative mode versus curative, how do I make some things better, versus palliative. There are lots of families that only, you were just describing one, that may be in a palliative care situation. Palliative care is pre-death. How do we make the patient as comfortable as possible while he or she is about to die? How do we do that? And what's palliative care even mean for a family business? Because we know lots of families that aren't going to survive. And we can believe we're strong enough to cure them. But as my father used to tell me, there's one rule that you have to keep in mind. This is when he was in the military. It's called JC negative. JC negative says, no matter how brilliant you are not Jesus Christ. JC negative. So don't think you can fix everything. Understand your limitations, fix what you can fix, and help where you can help. And that's the palliative care routine. Another context is beneficence versus scarcity. If we have tons of resources, it's different than if we have almost no resources. In the context of what someone from a psychological background, law, finance, etc., should be suggesting to others. This kind of fits in with the practice fit ideas. And here I would talk about the extremely practical research. And when I talk about really practical research, it serves multiple purposes. In addition to behavior and public policy prescriptions, it might also enhance relationships with or between organizations that you're involved with. It might produce years' worth of information valuable to the media, which is good if you run a center and you want to be known for the work that you do. And it might help develop cross-discipline alliances. And really practical research is pretty easy to get funded. If you can't find a source of funding for your research idea, chances are it's not practical. Chances. It's not always, but chances are it's not practical. All right, almost done here. One caveat, relevant research seeks truth, and sometimes truth causes anger, angst, and ill will, particularly when truth runs counter to conventional wisdom or against the interests of those with influence. Balance making stakeholders happy with preserving the truth. And as researchers, our goal is to always preserve the truth. Some characteristics of rigorous research is the research question is clear. It's a single question, it's not a multiple question. What a family business is and how it's used in the research is clearly defined. This is just basic research stuff. The sample that you've drawn from and how it has been selected is clearly defined. The literature review and theory development are tight and leave little questions. Your methods are clearly defined. Your measures are well thought through and researched themselves. Your data collection follows the highest standards. And you have discussions, conclusions, and really well thought through limitations. I have a friend who I've taught with quite a bit, George E. Manners, and he told me the line, "Nothing kills a bad product faster than great marketing." And likewise, I'm going to use my version of that, which is nothing kills people or businesses more effectively than bad science. To give you just a little bit more of a push in the direction of doing good research and good science. And the last thing is, it's really responsible to help the next generation, to encourage the next generation, to help guide the next generation. And the way we do that is critical to our success as researchers as we move into the last phases of our research career. So with that, I'll leave you with our little pal Yoda, who will tell you to always pass on what you've learned, to give what you've learned, life. And with that, I'll conclude my formal remarks right on the 11:30 button. Thank you very much.